I'm going to propose one idea. That's it. One idea. I'm calling it the Humanitarian Principle. This is sort of a work in progress for me. So here's just a brief recap. You heard the 20 years thing, the statistic on how long it often takes for people in Central America to immigrate to the United States, averaging over 20 years. Another problem is that there are a lot of different lines if you're going to try to immigrate into the United States, so it's odd. If you're a professional, you get put in one line. If you're from a certain area, a certain country, you get put in another line. That sort of thing happens. It's confusing. People don't know which lines they're supposed to go in when they're trying to immigrate. Visas are not given out. There's a cap on visas. Even worse, if they don't give out all the visas they need or that they have in a given year, they're just lost. It's like no rollover minutes for visas. That's basically what it is. If you don't use them in the allotted time, they just go away. They don't give you more. And I want to suggest that part of the problem with this, part of the problem is clearly political. But part of the problem is that it's not clear what we should be doing in these cases. There are a lot of arguments that point in different ways. I'm going to try to, I'm a philosopher, that's what I work with, what we should do. So I'm going to try to point there. So in the philosophic field, there are really only two questions about immigration. First question, whom should we admit? Second question, how should we treat them when they get here? Those are the two basic questions. Do they deserve special protections or things like that when they arrive or not? All right. For this talk, I'm only going to address the first question. Whom should we admit? That's the humanitarian principle, which is what I'm proposing, should be adopted for. By the way, if you want to know the impetus of the humanitarian principle, just think of what is actually written on the Statue of Liberty, you know. Give me your poor, huddled masses yearning to be free. That stuff, that's the idea that's behind this. I'm going to give you an outline, where people stand, the opposing sides. One side is, on one side of the political spectrum, it's the position of liberal egalitarianism. What do they argue? There are philosophers that argue for this, a number of them. Gooden, book written in 92, he effectively argues that we should just open our borders to everyone. That's what we should do. And roughly he gives three arguments for this. One of them is for the distribution of resources. If you're a liberal egalitarian, you believe that everyone has a certain right to a certain amount of resources. So in order to distribute resources globally more effectively, we ought to open our borders. Second, liberal egalitarians believe that the freedom to move, choose where you're going to live, is an essential feature of human autonomy. If that's true, we need to be able to immigrate to other places. Third, our world needs to ensure equal opportunity for everyone, right? If you believe in equal opportunity, then we need open borders so that people can pursue the opportunities elsewhere. You were talking about the 4-to-1 ratio at a minimum of extra pay. That's that sort of equal opportunity. Just because you were born in, say, Guatemala doesn't mean that as a person you should have diminished life chances. Okay, that's that position. Pretty predictable. So what about the other side? All right, that's Rand Paul, if you don't know. The other side, more or less as far as I can go, and in the position of political philosophy, to the other side is libertarianism. They argue for really small government. So does that mean that they think we should have closed borders? No, not at all. Rather interesting, Nozick is a major libertarian. Steiner wrote a book taking libertarian principles to immigration. He argued we should have open borders. Just straight up, we should have open borders. That's kind of surprising. So the two major ideological positions in the field of political philosophy agreed we should have open borders. Here's the reason why. Libertarians think that everyone has freedom, a kind of freedom to contract into anything, and you have a right to private property. Also, government should be small as a result. So, the reasoning goes, the government shouldn't be able to tell me who I can admit on my land. So if you're actually really committed to small government, then you should also be for open borders. Kind of odd. So there's the political spectrum for you. one on the far left, one on the left, one on the right. They both agree we should have open borders. So why don't we? The answer is they both agree we need to accommodate our theoretical positions to a number of practical arguments. I'll review 3. But this is the real reason why we don't have open borders. It's these practical arguments. Number 1, first kind of practical argument that you get. Some of these Uta reviewed. Economic. The idea is that we have scarce jobs. If our jobs are scarce, which in fact we don't have scarce jobs right now, but if we do have scarce jobs and we let a bunch of immigrants in, what will happen? There will be a glut in the labor market. They will drive down wages for our workers and give employers kind of leverage against them. That's one sort of argument. They also argue that they would absorb all the resources. They'll be on welfare, they'll be running all over our national parks, that stuff requires upkeep, those sorts of things. Those are the arguments that they make. So for economic reasons, it's a practical argument, we should have less immigration. Second set of concerns are cultural. You will sometimes hear these practical arguments. So this is by Barry. The idea is that mass migration affects a local area. So you guys can all imagine, like New York, LA, they have little Chinatowns, right? So a big immigrant group comes in and affects the local area. So that happens, sure. His argument is that national identities require strong bonds of solidarity. And if we just start letting lots of people in, they will disrupt the bonds of solidarity that make a social union possible. So what we ought to do is we ought to limit immigration to the absorptive capacities of a community, otherwise we'll break down the bonds that make sense of our social union and we'll get all chaos and stuff, okay? So that's that argument. It's a cultural one. The third argument is civic and criminal. Those two kind of get combined into one, kind of civic criminal. And the argument here is basically some immigrants have criminal backgrounds, this is the argument, and it would be imprudent to let criminals into our country. That's pretty much what that argument amounts to. It oversimplifies in significant ways, but that's what it does. Okay. So, I'm not going to give you a theoretical response because we don't need one. Theoretically, all spectrums agree we should open the borders. I have to respond to the practical arguments. That's where it is. So I'm going to give you a practical principle, something that you can accept, I think, kind of just based on common sense. I'm not going to give you a big theoretical architecture. That's the humanitarian principle. All right. So what do I mean by it? I'll give you the basic idea first. It works a little bit like a principle in jurisprudence, right? That you are innocent until proven guilty. What I want to suggest is that we ought to accept something similar for immigration. Something like, but not exactly, that a person is to be admitted, right? Unless we can prove that he or she will harm us. So the idea is to shift the burden of proof. Right now we have a country where, unless more or less you can prove that you're going to benefit us, we keep you out. What I'm saying is we have to shift the burden of proof to, unless we can show that you're going to harm us on a reasonable basis, we ought to let you in. That's the humanitarian principle. Now, I want to be clear, this is the philosophic move. This actually doesn't apply to admitting individuals. This isn't about whether or not Juan gets into the country, right? This is a principle about the criteria that we're going to use to assess whether or not Juan gets into the country. It's a principle about criteria, not a principle about admitting people directly. Okay. It's a principle of principles. This gives me a little more generality. Okay. And in a lot of lingo, here you go. A person is not to be debarred from entering unless the criteria under consideration highlight unambiguous matters which may be reasonably used to support the claim that greater harm will come to our republic than admitting him. All right. But I'm shifting the burden of proof so that you have to demonstrate a reasonable basis of harm coming to our country from admitting them, as opposed to needing to demonstrate, assuming that they are going to harm us and putting the burden of proof on them to show us that they're going to help us out or benefit us some way. That's the idea. We're shifting the burden, right? I'm going to give you two arguments in favor of why you should accept this. The first argument appeals to the better angels of our nature. It is Lincoln-ish. Nothing screams American like Lincoln-ish, right? So here we go. The argument here is, look, by the better angels of our nature, this is the sort of stuff we want to believe in, right? We want a society that has in which our global public institutions embody respect for equal persons. Basically means you think human dignity is a thing, humans have dignity, and our political institutions should reflect that. That is something that both Nozick, a libertarian, and John Rawls, a liberal egalitarian, can both agree to. Both sides of the political spectrum accept this, so I'm being ecumenical. If you agree with that, then that requires a support for equal opportunity. I think that's both sides too. You need to be able to move around and have equal opportunity, and that entails being able to immigrate on reasonable conditions. The humanitarian principle just tells you what those reasonable conditions are. That's it. That's all that suggests. So if you're committed to human dignity and you think our public institutions should embody that, we shouldn't have kings and monarchs, some people shouldn't be slaves, things like that. If you agree with that, then that ought to motivate you in a positive way to accept the humanitarian principle as suggesting the reasonable grounds for admitting people. But maybe you're not convinced. And our lesser angels, right? So here's the second half of the argument. The picture up here is a picture that appeared in Harper Weekly back in the 19th century, in which it depicts, this says blacks, it's hard to read, and that says Irish, right? And it shows that black people and the Irish are both equally subhuman. Because back in the day, the Irish were not fully human yet. All right. Why do I bring that up? Because I want to show that xenophobia, fear of foreigners, has existed for a long time. It exists now and will continue to exist for the foreseeable future. If you think that's true, then this argument might appeal to you. This, by the way, I take to be a darker feature of human sociality. We need a check or balance for this fact of human sociality, that humans tend to be, in groups, xenophobic. The humanitarian principle is the balance against this fact. It would be the institutional embodiment as a check or balance. So those are the two arguments in favor of the humanitarian principle, tilting the burden of proof. That's what I'm doing. All right, so what would that mean concretely? What does that mean about the practical arguments? Let's go back to them. Economic criteria, should we use them? There are a bunch of arguments here. They're complicated, but basically, no. It's really difficult to measure the positive impact of an immigrant. Just take an economist, have them come up with ways to measure it, it's hard to tell. Partly because we don't know what an immigrant is going to do. Okay, so it becomes problematic. So economic criteria shouldn't be used in deciding whether or not to admit someone, whether or not they're going to harm us. All of that stuff. If there'll be a drain on the system, I'm suggesting there's just no way to measure that. All right. Cultural criteria. Will they disrupt the bonds of national solidarity? And the answer is no, they won't. This is based on a mistaken conception both of how cultures work. Cultures aren't static like this. They change, right? So if the Navajo start incorporating jazz in their music, does that mean that they lost their culture, or did they just develop? Kind of, right? Also, we have a multinational society with many, many communities. We don't work by having one social bond. That's not how it works anymore. So it's not really a concern. We can have Chinatown, and guess what? The United States goes on just fine. Right?
Yeah, but the lily's gone. Just
Yeah. Right. So there's a false assumption there. Finally, civic criteria or criminal criteria. My argument here is this is an exceptionally complicated field. There could possibly be a reasonable basis here in some cases. I want to suggest that if we're very careful, perhaps we can use these criteria, right? But I mean, you have to remember, people can have criminal backgrounds for a number of really dumb reasons. In other countries, you can write an op-ed, criticize the dictator of your country, and then become a criminal. I don't really think that's a problem, so we have to be a lot more selective. It's not just any criminal background as it is at present that excludes you. It's the right criminal background that we care about. So if we did that, the result would be changing the burden of proof. We would streamline the whole visa process. There would be one line. Everyone would go in it. There'd be a simple burden of proof. And we'd give out as many as people are deserving. And that would be the end of it.